running through the doorway of our old living room in Aleppo, Syria, when the building started to shake. It had been a normal school day for me thus far, a day of wolfing down my cereal, just stand up early, sitting at the front door, backpack in hand, staring at my sequins shoes, and occasionally nagging my mom. Mama, can we go to school now? Mom. A day full of teasing my friends, teasing my younger brother's friends, and enjoying my classes. English first, then math, art, Arabic, and the best class of all time, science. My dad picked me up that day, and as we got closer to our house, I started seeing more and more people, which confused me, because in a time when Aleppo was getting more dangerous, people left their house less often. So you can imagine my shock when I started seeing all these people heading to the college right across the street from my house. I asked my dad. He says it was the first day of final exams, meaning that students who were scared to show up all semester had to attend today. When we got home, Mom was home too, something that her job as an anesthesiologist didn't allow her to do much. So with a newly found excitement to tell her all about my day, I rushed to the living room. Then the building shakes. My mom, dad, younger brothers, and I all collapsed to the floor. My hands go automatically to my ear, expecting a bang, but the only thing I hear is a deafening silence. It was the pressure that thrusted into my ears, the blood that rushed to my head. I squeeze my eyes, but both open and closed, I only see black. It feels like forever until the shaking stops. But it wasn't over, because I hear a piercing screech and I rush to the balcony. As I step out, I see a military jet drop a bomb on the university right across the street from my house, the street that we just passed on our way back from school. But before I'm able to comprehend what had happened, I find myself on the floor again, on my back, staring up into a white cloud of dust. I pause in my story and turn to the United Nations employee. 10 years old, twiddling my thumbs, looking down at my feet, I consider how best to explain why we had to leave Syria. Should I mention the random murders and kidnaps? Or the multi-day powder outages, the water shortage, or the markets with empty shelves and tripled prices? The UN representative interrupts me. Yeah, that's war. But why now? I shoved down the feeling, the images, the university where I might have studied one day, bombed, our scary flee to Lebanon on an unfinished road, our fights to obtain our basic human rights, to go to school, to rent, to drive. I shoved down the look of despair in my father's face as he waved goodbye when he had to return back to Syria to continue providing for us. I shoved down my feelings of hopelessness as I later saw my dad on a hospital bed with a traumatic brain injury after a bomb struck his workplace. Now, on our 6th attempt of seeking refugee status, I find myself sitting across that same employee who didn't know as an 8th grader and the best English speaker in my household, I was the one to rescue my now half-paralyzed father from a detention center when he first arrived here to the United States. But behind the maze of the US immigration system, the seeming impossibility to seek an education, and my desperate attempts to teach myself science through every lab and summer program I could find, I didn't know the sinister reason behind why we had to come here until last summer. I was working with a lab on a research project about the sea level rise in the Gulf of Maine. And I remember searching up theoretical scenarios of what could happen if we don't address climate change. But I was struck with a real-life example, an example that hit home. You see, before the Syrian revolution, Syria faced a severe drought for 3 years that exceeded all scientific predictions. Crops died, Syria's economy suffered, farmers migrated into overpopulated cities, disrupting social hierarchies and heightening political and economical tensions that finally snapped. It wasn't until after 5 years after leaving Syria that I learned that the war that took away the life of some of my family and friends, the war that left many Syrians stranded and alone, whether between the rubble of destroyed buildings or in other countries, was ignited by climate change. But of course, the thought of climate change ever contributing to the Syrian revolution didn't cross the mind of any Syrian I knew. It was a silent killer. I tell my mom, and she looks at me in disbelief. I tell my dad, I tell my siblings, my cousins, my uncles and aunts, and I find myself facing the same puzzled faces. Nobody knew. But then I wonder, how could I have not known? How did I not catch on to the signs? A memory clicks into place. I remember walking the souks of Aleppo with my dad. I spotted a carton of cherries and was immediately reminded by lahm bkaras, which was a famous dish from Aleppo made of meat and cherries that we ate almost every week. So I pointed and asked, "Baba, can we get this?" He shook his head. The price was too high. Cherries were no longer a daily treat anymore, but a luxury slowly disappearing from our fridge and our markets. Then I bring myself back to where I am now, and I wonder how neatly this fits with the same repeating stories in the news today. The extreme heat waves in the Middle East, the horrors of the Syrian civil war currently repeating in Yemen. Even here around me, I can't seem to escape the effects of climate change. My home city, Revere, is one of the most vulnerable communities to sea level rise in the Gulf of Maine. I see students that go to my school having to evacuate their houses in the winter to avoid floods. Is this really our future? I didn't anticipate that my passion for science would reveal such a stark future for me and my peers. With this knowledge, how could I not do something about this? I remember my feelings as I sat on the floor when the university was bombed, hopeless and scared. How can I let what had happened in Syria to happen to my new home now? I feared that just like the voices of Syrians who first experienced the signs of climate change were silenced, the people of Revere would be forgotten. So in my hopeful attempts, I tried to connect with several nonprofit organizations, and I started working as a fellow for our climate. I hosted a community-based event in Boston to advocate for constituents' voices from the Boston area about climate policy that are equitable and backed by science, to ensure that the voices of cities like Revere were heard. I also applied some of my research skills from science to analyze and compare the climate bills in the Massachusetts State House. And I later taught youth from other environmental organizations like the Sunrise Movement, Extension Rebellion, and Divest Ed on what I've learned. But most importantly, I continuously met up with legislators and their constituents to discuss climate policy that will effectively prevent further acceleration of climate change while still being equitable for communities of low income and color. Actually, less than a month ago, I was sitting next to the Speaker of the House and my representative, Speaker Robert DeLeo. I remember looking around his office, and my heart swells as I saw so many young constituents advocating for their marginalized communities and fighting for equitable science-based climate policy. But I cannot do this work alone. The voices of youth, people of color, and communities of lower income need to be heard, need to be amplified. So will you join our fight? As Massachusetts sea levels continue to rise faster than anywhere else in the world, will you study? Will you strike? Will you speak to your representatives? Will you join our movement when it's hard and when it's glorious? If you will, then we can guide you.